Okay, good morning. My name is Barbora Tribulová, and I would like to talk today about the rise and fall of postmodern architecture in Slovakia, or about some problematic moments of reflection of postmodern architecture in Slovakia, because I would like to show that it's the reflection of postmodern architecture that influences its rise and fall. So I hope I will show it in some way. I was interested in a reflection of architecture several times ago, and 2 years ago, one special case caught my mind, and is this building, or rather the fate of this building, one of the important examples of postmodern architecture in Slovakia, Slovak Savings Bank building in Bratislava, where the building, even if it was finished in 1994, so not so far in history, it's an example of really achieved postmodern will in architecture. And the reason why I'm talking about this building is that now this building has been totally rebuilt. We can say the postmodern architecture was destroyed because its new view or its new rebuilding, it's not totally postmodern. This building, there were no technical problems with the building. It was not told to be pulled down. So there must be another reason for destruction or to rebuild it. And at first, we have to realize what was this building, or what does this building meant for postmodern architecture in Slovakia. Especially for it was finished so late. The architect Ivan Markov from Atelier Markov was one of the founding generation of postmodern architecture. He participated in formation of its reflection in our architectural scene. And Slovak Savings Bank was a brief example of postmodern principles. Its location was also very important, or it's really important, let's say strategic. It was built at the edge of a historical city center and the late modern setup of the city and the city traffics. So its context discussed between those two oppositions. You can see some appropriations of traditional language like Attic or Butters and so on. They were transcribed in new materials and functions. And postmodern polysemantics was written in this building. Besides this, in 2016, the nature of this building has totally changed. Not only its nature, but also the function. This polyfunctional building had transformed into starter-flat housing, so into a monofunctional one. But what is the problem is there is no postmodern speech left. The architecture is totally desemantic. desemanticized. And the new building became anti-Semitic. And here are two questions rising up into my mind. Why and how this is possible that such a thing could happen to such a relevant example of postmodern culture or architecture. And it's because besides of contemporary approach to postmodernity in Slovakia, and if this building was an icon, is there a postmodern iconoclasm in contemporary Slovakia? In looking for the answer, we have to find out how the postmodern architecture was reflected in Slovakia since its birth. Because of political situation after World War II, the culture and so the architecture was controlled by official doctrine. So the new ways of, let's say, Western thinking were imported just slowly through few articles in magazines. Popular theoretic works like Charles Jang's Language of Postmodern Architecture, Verterius, Count Brown, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture were barely translated and available. That's why rather works of German theorist Heinrich Klotz were read and translated. But doesn't matter who had composed postmodern thoughts, the important fact is the selection of their text, of the text that have been published in Czechoslovakia. And I'm pretty sure you know those texts, but I would like to mention that only some parts were translated and published in 80s Czechoslovakia. And let's say what were the most important thoughts that have been accepted from there. Yet the title of those texts disclose the interest in meaning in architecture, and the meaningful language speaks about the context of architecture, speaking about the context in architecture, seems to be the most important thought, which has been often mentioned in domestic publications. But there were different approaches to building meaningfully. Even if it seems now that postmodernity was a common movement, there were individual demonstrations, and the individuals often brought their experiences with postmodern architecture or thinking. Like, for example, architect Jan Bahna, who was thought to be one of the beginners of postmodernity in Czechoslovakia. Paradoxically, we'll see that he would be one of its grave diggers, but in 80s he reported about Venice Biennale architecture or about IBA in Berlin, etc. And he was also one of architects reporting about meetings in Spišská Kapitula organized by art historian Andrea Štefančíková in 1984 and few years after. These meetings grew up from the need of discussion about contemporary architecture. They were focused on the crisis, the need of discussion about contemporary architecture, the crisis in architecture of late socialist realism, which had led to uniform anonymous buildings, not appropriate to psychological needs of habitants. The meetings quickly turned into discussions of or about postmodern architecture, viewed as an opposition to this anonymous uniformity. And not only theories, but also postmodern works have been presented in Spišská kapitula. Fortunately, there is a publication of texts and works presented in those meetings, so we know now what those were important then, and also the fact that there was a publication edited shows us the relevance of the meetings and of discussions about postmodern architecture. Another benefit of Spišská kapitula meetings was the ambition to connect foreign postmodern architects, or at least their works or texts. For example, Hungarian architect Imre Makovec was invited 2 times to join these meetings, and his works and thoughts have influenced a lot one of the postmodern tendencies in Slovakia. Jan Bahna talked about the spirit of freedom that arises from his architecture, and the freedom of forms, of topics, or of architectural language. And probably this is the reason why postmodern architecture was so welcomed in Slovakia. In Spišská kapitula, some of its benefits were formulated, such as the opposition to modern lack of meanings, or to modernist belief in originality. That's why looking for context of place often led to use of historical or traditional forms, shifted to new meanings in contemporary culture. So the postmodern architecture rised up in a process of being modern with all its social and political context. In Slovakia or in Czechoslovakia, it was connected to will to break years of normalization. Postmodern was totally contra-normalizative. With the accent of individual or local context. That's why this local context was so important for postmodern architects, and they would like to show it in the building. For this reason, postmodern architecture became sometimes narrative, and historical forms and eclecticism was an ideal way to communicate this narrative will to public. But there were 2 a little bit different ways of meaning of context. The first one presented by, for example, Jan Bahna. The first one understood the context in urbanism. You can see here on the picture how, for example, Jan Bahna thought about the context in the urbanistic way, where the buildings from the local context are incorporated in the formation of new building and its meaning. So the buildings communicated with architecture of place, or rather they have built the place. I'm not talking about Jan Bahna like this, but I'm mentioning him also because he was an author of building of Hotel Forum, or today Crown Plaza, which was built against the Slovak Savings Bank at the same square. So this is the context, the postmodern context of the square, which is really rooted in the square, and it underlines the problem with the destruction of postmodern architecture. The other one way of working with the local context was a way of looking for genius loci. The architects have searched in tradition, in cultural roots, and they would lather to build this genius loci. To express this, they often use a strong formal language. They were often inspired by work and thoughts of Imre Makovec. And this strong formal language and also the inspiration taken from abroad became the first and also the strongest reproof of postmodern architecture in next years. At the end of the century, some summarizations also in architecture and architecture history were made. And as the social and political situation has changed, the attitude to postmodern architecture wasn't so adorative like during the recent years. This summarization were presented in a lot of publications. For example, in several magazines. And the problem with postmodern architecture turned into the problem of formal language, as the most problematic was the reproof of schematism and formalism. Even if there was something more, a dialogue with the local context. But it was difficult to express this context when reproducing images of architecture in publications. The summaries of histories of architecture didn't spend much spaces for talking about each cases. It's the nature of summary. So the postmodern architecture started to be presented rather by images than by texts. And the accumulation of such images could disturb someone's eye because of such plurality of forms and languages. But the problem was not only at the end of the recent century. The problem is the reflection of architecture in publications. There are only few monographs of Slovak architecture, and if there is one, merely it's a monograph of modern architecture or modernist architect. At least in 90s, there were some small monographs dedicated to a few postmodern architects, but we can say they were rather brochures. And they were published just in small edition. Monograph is a kind of publication where there is much more space for representation of ideas of or theories instead of mere informations about works. But there is much more periodic publication where there is no such space. In Slovakia, there are three important architectural magazines, Project, Arc, and Architecture and Urbanism. And only the last one of them is focused on theoretic studies, even if magazine Project had an ambition to bring some theories also. Both these magazines are published in low periodicity. Magazine Arc is the most frequent, and it's a kind of publication popular in public because it presents new works of architecture. The problem is the form of presentation. A lot of images are accompanied by just some affirmative text. So it seems like the most important quality of architecture is its visuality. And if visuality of postmodern architecture was disturbing eyes, it's not so often presented, of course. Images of modern architecture seems to be more attractive for graphic design, and not only for graphic design. In magazine Architecture and Urbanism, there were also some theories which were presented about modern architecture and about the preservation of modern architecture, because there is a need of preservation of modern architecture and it should be theoretically supported. Unfortunately, there is no need for preservation of postmodern architecture, formulated in no magazine, no monograph, no publications. And for this reason, the attitude of public to postmodern architecture is not so well, and it was not so big problem to destroy postmodern architecture in the center of main city in Slovakia. Not even the architecture was so relevant in postmodern context. So looking back, to conclude, we can say that the infiltration of, or the beginning of postmodern architecture was accompanied by texts and theories of architects and of theoretics. But now the architecture is much more presented by visual qualities, and probably that's the reason why postmodern architecture is not so well reflected, is not so needed to be preserved. Thank you.
Very much, Barbara. It was very interesting to see your presentation. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. I'm Ondor Vasily Nigodai. I'm going to talk tomorrow. Just a question. Could you please, I have actually two questions. Could you please give a frame of this story? When did it start, the postmodernism in Slovakia? Because it was, maybe you said, but and when it was ended.
Okay, the rise of postmodern architecture in Slovakia could be dated in really in late 70s, but more in 80s, at the beginning of 80s, because in the beginning of 80s, some texts of postmodern theoretics were brought in Slovakia, and also, but I'm talking about the rise of postmodern architecture in thinking about postmodern architecture.
I meant buildings. Concrete buildings.
Concrete buildings.
Yeah,
in the late 80s. In the late 80s, yeah.
Please don't misunderstand me. I don't want to confront you, but it's a very interesting question. A few years ago, 2009, there was a book published on the V4 countries' architecture: Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and expressis verbis on the Czech text. The Czech historian said that there was no postmodern architecture in Czechoslovakia, interestingly, and the Czechoslovakian, because you have one country, didn't use the semantic power of the postmodern architecture against the power, the rule, and they had a very strong need to communicate to the world their modern heritage. So that's the reason why the 1992 Seville building, your pavilion, together with the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, was a strict modernist pavilion from Jan Stempel. So where is the truth? Because anytime I am meeting with Slovakian leaders of your chamber, they always say, "Oh, Andy, you got such a nice, beautiful postmodern heritage in your country. In our country, in Slovakia, modernism is the overall style." So it seems that there are two confronting narratives now. Could you please enlighten me? So that was too long, I know, but you know.
I'm not sure if I'm able to make some conclusion about this, because as I was talking about, for example, Jan Bahna, he is one of the architects who often write about the architecture, and he's often considered like an architect who could be thought like theorist, but he in the beginning of postmodernity in Slovakia or Czechoslovakia, he really brought some thought about postmodernity. He also built some buildings that could be presented like postmodern. For example, those buildings are from, or the interior is from Jan Bahna, and he, at the end of 90s, he just switched his mind, and for him, the postmodernity is something which is not so relevant in Czechoslovakia or in late 90s, just in Slovakia. So it's probably the problem is lies somewhere in the architects them own, because if for example Jan Bahna would like to be an architect, a relevant architect now, and we say that postmodern is death, he can't stand this side, So I think this is a problem. But for example, another architect considered like postmodern architect, Peter Pastor, who is really influenced by Imre Makovec. He always stand this side of postmodernity about the language, about the narrative and meaningful language of postmodern architecture.
Yeah, but I think if we would like to understand, or our aim is to understand postmodernism through concrete buildings, then instead of, and we miss, I don't know, the networks and the publications, we miss the point as well on postmodernism. More question? Yes?
I would like to ask if any postmodern buildings in Slovakia, how they are assessed now, or maybe they are included in heritage list?
No. The discussion about the heritage is stopped at the discussion about the modern heritage, because now it's the problem that the modern architecture just started to be considered valuable for being heritage. So maybe in next years the discussion will turn also in postmodern architecture, but I'm afraid that there won't be nothing to heritage. So.
Hi, Radu Ponta from Bucharest. When you presented the Slovak Savings Bank, and its reconstruction, it looked extremely familiar coming from Bucharest. And the question or comment that I wanted to make is that linked to the architectural production of the 1990s in Slovakia, because the savings bank was actually a 1990s building. In our local case, I have no knowledge of the Slovak one. The buildings from the 1990s are, well, they're funny. Architects, on the first hand, wanted to experience everything all at once because of a newly acquired freedom. But on the other, and this led to, for example, a lot of technical issues regarding how they wanted to work with completely new materials that were all of a sudden available, and so on and so forth. You can see where this is leading. And on the other hand, there were a lot of other technical issues that these buildings had or have, depending on whether they were rebuilt or not, that stem from actually from the construction market, not necessarily from the architects themselves. It's not necessarily a question of the quality of the architect or the craftsmanship of the architect. It's a question of the early days of the reconstructions after the. So I wanted to ask you whether this decision to redo it, to rebuild it, has anything to do with a type of pragmatism that sees anything other than the modern, postmodern face of the building. Thank you.
Okay. One thing is important, and I didn't mention it. That the concept of the building was from 1987. So it took so many times to finish it. And also the important thing is that this picture is from 2014, and everything in this building, every administration space, every shopping restaurant, everything functions. So the buildings was technically and practically used. So this couldn't be the reason to rebuild it.
Very short question. If there were a ranking in the Slovakian architecture, where would you put this building in this state? I mean, the first one, I mean, if, you know...
In the last 100 years?
I mean, yeah, I mean, yeah, generally, because it's always the question of canonization, where you put the building. Is it a painful thing that it has been lost, or many of the Slovakian architects are revealed now, oh, well, thank God it's gone.
Okay.
So where would you put it?
It depends of which rank we are talking, because in the rank of architectural scene, it's a painful thing. But in the public rank, it's nothing. For the public, the building doesn't seem or doesn't meant some relevant architecture. And this is the problem. This is the problem that there is a lack of discussion about postmodernity relevant for public, and the public couldn't evaluate this architecture when there is no discussion about it.
Okay, I have one more question. That you said it is an iconic building. An icon of postmodern architecture. For who in Slovakia? For the architectural scene, because when you come at the academy and start to study the postmodern architecture, this is one of the buildings which was shown like the postmodern architecture
or the end of the postmodern architecture in Slovakia.
So it's already part of your architecture history in Slovakia?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you very much. If we have no more questions, thank you.